Hey, good morning. Happy Wednesday morning to you, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We are in the midst of a thematic study of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And I've been sharing with you the fact that Paul 10 times uses either the present active indicative or the present passive indicative to speak of the dead ones being raised. And the objections that are offered to mitigate the force of those present passive indicatives or the present actives. And of course, the irony of that is that those same individuals who would say, well, that doesn't mean anything, would turn around and say, when Paul uses the present infinitive, for he must reign, they argue, rather vehemently I might add, we must honor the present infinitives, which means Christ would continue to reign until the end. So my question has been, and continues to be, if we must honor the present active indicatives that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 15, if we must honor the aorist active indicatives that Paul uses, if we must honor the perfect indicatives that Paul uses, then why is it that all of a sudden, when we come to his tenfold use of the present passive indicatives or the present active indicative, when he's speaking about the resurrection of the dead ones, all of a sudden, those Greek tenses mean nothing? If, however, we honor Paul's use of the present passive and the present active indicatives in 1 Corinthians 15, it demands that he was saying that the resurrection of the dead ones was already underway. So what could that mean? As I have pointed out to you, it pretty clearly cannot refer to physical resurrection, or else Paul would be saying, look around. The graves are being emptied. Dead bodies are coming out of the ground. You see, we've got a huge problem here. A huge, huge problem. The presuppositional approach to 1 Corinthians 15 that says Paul's talking about physical resurrection has to be conflated, has to be joined with, has to be harmonized with the entire story of biblical eschatology and resurrection. And the view of physical resurrection being the focus of Paul's discussion simply will not fly. Now, I want you to consider the following. Let us assume for a moment, that Paul is talking about physical resurrection. And that Paul is saying, the physical resurrection has begun. Ask yourself how that would have been possible for Paul to affirm that, and for anyone to believe it. In other words, back to the point, that would have Paul saying, hey guys, look around. Those of you, those scoffers who are denying the resurrection of the dead ones, all you got to do is look at the graves. All you got to do is go out to the graveyards, go out to the sepulchres, go out to the caves where they're being buried, and you know they're all empty, just like Jesus' physical grave was empty. Do you see what that demands? Now, on a directly related note, Paul wrote in 2 Timothy chapter 2, 18, about Hymenaeus and Philetus, who, Paul said, say that the resurrection is already past. Oh, wait a minute. Do you see how this conflates so powerfully with 1 Corinthians 15? If it's the case that the resurrection of the dead in 1 Corinthians 15 is the resurrection, the raising of biologically dead human corpses, and if we honor the present passive indicatives, as we must, then that means that Paul was saying the physical resurrection is going on. It's taking place. So we then come to 2 Timothy chapter 2, where Paul says, Hymenaeus and Philetus says, the resurrection is already past. Well, if the resurrection was already going on, physical resurrection was already going on in 1 Corinthians 15, and if Hymenaeus and Philetus were talking about the physical resurrection of every human being who has ever lived and died and decomposed and gone into the ground, let me ask you this question. How would it have been possible for Paul to convince anyone that the physical resurrection of every human being who has ever lived was already taking place? Do you see how it would have been so easy for Paul, if he is arguing with people denying physical resurrection, do you see how easy it would have been for Paul to say, look, you guys, I'm telling you, you guys just don't get it. The resurrection of the dead ones is already underway. Just go to the graveyards and see. But Paul didn't use that argument, did he? Look how easy it would have been for Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 2 in arguing against Hymenaeus and Philetus to say, Hymenaeus and Philetus say that the resurrection has already passed, but guys, all of the graveyards are still there. Can't you see that? And oh, by the way, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 2, Paul said, don't let anyone convince you that the day of the Lord has come and is present. Boy, it's amazing to see people so desperate to destroy. Oh, by the way, to destroy the Greek tenses in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. So let me ask you, if and since the day of the Lord and the resurrection are synchronous events, how would it have been possible to say that the day of the Lord had already come and was in their midst, which would mean that the resurrection of all of the dead who had ever lived was already present and in their midst? Which would mean, by the way, if we take the traditional view of the, quote, time of the end, that the earth had already been burned up, time had already ended. How could you convince anyone of that? Paul couldn't. You couldn't. I couldn't. This is the problem when we run into the text of 1 Corinthians 15, 2 Thessalonians 2, and 2 Timothy chapter 2. If we honor the Greek tenses as we must of 1 Corinthians 15, we run headlong into 2 Thessalonians 2 and 2 Timothy chapter 2, which presents an absolute, utter impossibility. Let me urge you to get a copy of my book, How Is This Possible? This book focuses on this question. How could anyone convince anyone that the traditional view of the day of the Lord as an earth-burning, time-ending event had already happened and was in their midst? How could anyone convince anyone that the resurrection of the dead, a physical event of the raising of every human dead corpse that had ever lived and died and decomposed, had now come out of the grave? How could anybody convince anybody that was already past? Go to my website, order the book, How Is This Possible? Make the mention that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund your shipping. Well, thank you again so much for being with me on this morning's morning musings. And yes, we have more on the already but the not yet of the resurrection that is demanded by Paul's use of the present passive indicatives in 1 Corinthians 15. So we will see you on the flip side.